everyone, and welcome back to round 7 now already of the Maia Chess Open. I just finished my game and this game was amazing. Let's talk about it. So in round 7 I faced Martim Fernandes from Portugal. He is rated 1801 and he is, I believe, 16 years old. So I was not really happy with this pairing initially because I was doing really well in the tournament and yesterday I lost my game, so I knew that I was going to get a lower pairing today. And seeing that my opponent is rated 1800, I was both scared that my opponent is perhaps underrated, and also kids are unpredictable, so you never know what to expect. And on top of that, this is not really nice because if I win, I don't win so much rating, and if I lose or draw, then I lose quite a lot of rating. So yeah, it's a scary pairing. So I was not so happy with it, but I thought, okay, let's still try to have a good time and let's try to focus on the chess instead. And I was playing with white pieces, so when I saw that my opponent plays Sicilian, I got really excited because I love playing against a Sicilian. So I played e4, c5, knight f3, e6. My opponent didn't have many games on the database, so I was not sure about which Sicilian. Maybe my opponent decided to play another Sicilian recently. Kids tend to change their repertoire quite a lot, so I was not really sure what to expect, of course. But okay, I played d4, c takes d4, knight takes d4, knight c6, knight c3, queen c7. This is actually all part of my preparation, and here I decided to go for bishop e3. This is not a move that I play often. I used to play this, I think, quite a bit, but I started to play different things here. But here I decided to go for bishop e3 because I saw a game of my opponent where he played the move knight f6 here, and then he got hit by g4, and he didn't really handle this quite well. So I thought, let's take a look at this g4 idea. Now, instead of knight f6 right away, my opponent went for a6. So I thought, okay, this is... Now g4 makes no sense, of course. So I had to think, okay, what do I do instead? And I thought, let's just play a3 because this also stops any sort of bishop b4. So yeah, it just makes a lot of sense to play a3. We're kind of waiting for black's move here, and my opponent plays the move knight f6. So here I thought, let's go with g4. It is not the main move in the position, and the biggest reason for that is that there's one move here that is by far the best. All the other moves are slightly worse. They're not that great, but it's not the end of the world. But the problem is that one logical move can just completely ruin the game. If you don't really know what you're doing here, then it can go really fast. It can go wrong really fast. So that's why, I don't know if you heard that. That's the first time during a recap I hear sirens. Okay, anyway, so yeah, I played with g4. And here, black is supposed to play the move h5. This is the only way, the best way by far, to deal with this, because if I play g5 now, then my opponent can play knight g4. And that is stopping any sort of attack. My bishop is in a very bad position, so yeah, it's not great at all. Then what's left is for me to take on h5. But this, of course, after rook takes h5, h4, this was all part of my prep, and it sort of feels like my attack is dying out already because I don't have a g-pawn anymore, and I don't really have ways to break through on the king side. So I figured that if this would happen in the game, then I know what to do, I guess. I have an idea, but yeah, I wasn't too concerned because my opponent is lower rated, so I should have some sort of confidence, right? So yeah, anyway, if this was going to happen in the game, I was ready for it, but instead my opponent went to move d6. And this is probably the only mistake my opponent did. Of course, some things happened afterwards, but this is the sole reason that my opponent lost the game, which is crazy. Imagine making a mistake on move 8 that is basically deciding the game, the outcome of the game. So yeah, I wasn't sure if this move was correct or not, but I figured that if I am able to play g5, there must be something wrong here for black, right? So g5, knight d7, f4, and I'm just going at it with those pawns. I have nothing to lose. My opponent's pieces are really bad over here, so I'm not really worried about anything I'm not worried about the safety of my king. If anything, if I really need to, I can go long castle and survive somehow. But for now, I'm just pushing on the king side, and this king is feeling very unsafe. So my opponent for b5, and here I thought bishop h3 because we were threatening to take on e6 here. So let's say if my opponent was going to play bishop b7, I was ready to take on e6 because after takes e6, knight takes e6. The queen has to move, let's say queen c8. I just take on g7, king has to move, and this king is completely exposed. I have 3 pawns for the piece, which is more than enough because this, especially because of the kings not being safe at all on f7. So that's why I thought this must be completely winning, and that's why I'm just preparing to capture on e6. Of course, my opponent does not allow this and plays knight b6, but I knew that if my opponent plays the move knight b6, then I can take on c6, because queen takes c6, queen d4, and suddenly I'm forking the knight and the pawn on g7, and my opponent cannot defend both at the same time. My opponent tried to play queen c5, and I knew that if my opponent plays queen c5, well, I missed this move at first, but just before I played queen to d4, I realized that there's queen c5, and I had to slow down for a sec, like, okay, there is a move that is annoying, because if I now take on c5, then d takes c5, and my opponent is fine. If I take on g7, I lose the bishop with check. So that's why I have to be very careful here. And instead, I fortunately have the move b4, essentially forcing the trade of queens. My opponent could have played queen c4, queen c7, because if I take on b6, then my knight on c3 drops, right? So that's not quite ideal. But instead I would have taken on g7, win the pawn on g7, and we continue the game from here. I'm still completely winning here. So instead my opponent traded the queens, and here I was really happy because after knight c7, knight c4, bishop takes g7, rook g8, I'm just up a pawn. I just have to play precise here and make sure to not give my opponent any sort of counterplay, because e5 comes in now and I retreat with the bishop. Let's say I take on e5, I allow this bishop to become alive again and help my opponent's pawn structure a bit, because now I'm playing bishop f2 and I'm accepting that my opponent can take the pawn on f4. So let's say bishop takes h3 was actually played, rook takes h3, and my opponent took on f4. And here I gave the pawn back, but as you can see, my opponent's pawn structure is really bad. This pawn and also that pawn, they're really terrible, and also the pawn on d6. All of these pawns are actually really bad, and because of that, I'm very confident about my chances here. My pieces are much more active. I have this amazing square d5 for my knight, super centralized, much better than this knight on c4, which also looks good, but I always have this pawn push on the queen side a4 to annoy that pawn that is defending that knight on c4. So the knight is not that strong on c4. I already played a4 here, and here my opponent went for the move king to d7. So the trick here is that I don't really want to take, because it looks like I'm winning the pawn, but as you can see from the evaluation, it's not so clear anymore. I'm actually going to lose. I was thinking rook b8 here probably, because now that the knight has to move and I'm losing the pawn on b4. So this is a way for my opponent to come back. So he found a really nice resource here to just move the king, connect the rooks, and that's why I'm not able to win the pawn. So that plan is for now abandoned. Instead, I'm going for knight d5 now. And also, I didn't play knight d5 earlier because I wanted to play a4 first. I just wanted to create the tension on the queen side and then decide to play knight d5, because yeah, I'm not really in a rush, but I like creating some tension on the queen side here. It feels good, because now my opponent always has to keep an eye on this move, and my opponent doesn't really want to take themselves, of course, because then the knight on c4 is weak and the rook gets this open file. So yeah, that's why. My opponent goes for rook gf8, and I play bishop to d4 because I don't want to allow any sort of f5, because if f5 would be played, I play en passant, of course, so that would be amazing for me. My opponent plays move rook fe8, and here I thought, oh, I have to be careful, because if I play carelessly, then maybe my opponent gets to play, maybe not f5, because again, en passant, but there are bishop takes g5, rook takes e4 ideas, all right? So I have to be a little bit careful. Instead, I went for king e2. I went for king e2 because after bishop d8, I'm going to d3 the king. My king is safe, my pawn is defended, life's good. So bishop e7, my opponent doesn't know what to do anymore because everything is protected here, and also now I'm actually threatening to take on b5, so that's why my opponent had to move the bishop again. And here I just decided to take the pawn on f4 because that pawn is a little bit annoying. I was thinking of the move rook f3, but I hated that after knight e5 check, bishop takes, pawn takes. These two pawns are working well together, and I thought I don't really want to be dealing with that. And that's why I thought there's no need to allow any of this. It's still completely winning, but it's a matter of trying to win in a clean way, without giving your opponent any sort of chances. So I took on f4, knight e5 check. I took that, of course, d takes e5, knight d5. Now I just have a much better knight. Like, this knight is completely superior. Like, it's the best piece on the board. King c6, and here my opponent's, it's completely losing, right? I'm threatening knight b6. There's like so many threats in the position. So my opponent plays king c6, and after this, I just take on b5 check, and I'm already completely winning here because after pawn takes, I can just take the rook on a8, rook takes, and then I take the bishop on e7, so that is winning. And instead my opponent went for king takes b5, but after knight c7 check, I'm just winning the exchange. I take the pawn on a6 as well, as if things couldn't have been worse for my opponent. My opponent tries to defend with rook d7, but here I give a series of checks. The bishop covers because if king d4, then rook d3 check, and the rook will be lost on d7. So instead, bishop c5, rook d3, forcing the trade because if rook b7 or something, then I play rook d5. And if rook b5, I would first collect the pawn on e5 and then probably just trade everything on c5 because I am up 2 pawns in a pawn endgame. That is easily winning. So that is why rook d4 was played. Trade off a pair of rooks here, king takes d4. Here I played the tricky c3 check. There was a joke going on in the chat that I'm pushing all my pawns except one pawn, and that was considered a sin. So yeah, I made sure to move my last pawn as well because this game has all been about pushing pawns. But yeah, I just give a check here because I don't want my opponent to take my pawns. If my opponent takes a pawn on c3, then of course I take the bishop on c5, so that's completely fine. King c4 was played, and here rook c7 with a zugzwang because my opponent cannot take the pawn. The bishop would be hanging, and basically the king has to move now. And if king b5, then I just grab the pawns on the king side and win easily. So yeah, this is the moment that my opponent resigned, and I was extremely happy with this game. With not only just the result, but also the way that I won this game. It felt super smooth. I was left with 49 minutes on the clock, which happens literally never. I'm always the one in time trouble, but here on move 39, I still have 49 minutes. So I was really happy with how I played. And yeah, I was just feeling it today. I thought, I'm just going for the attack. If my opponent goes for this line that I prepared, then I was feeling really confident. And yeah, I was a bit nervous at first because I thought, what to expect, what to think, what's going to happen in the game. But yeah, once I was able to push the pawns on the king side, that's when I started to be really confident, and I thought I'm actually going to, I feel like I was going to win this quite easily just because the attack just feels super smooth. It just feels so nice, and my opponent doesn't really have much in the opening there. So yeah, that really goes to show how important preparation is and how those little details in openings can really make the difference. And I really think that because my opponent didn't really know how to counter this g4 move, that's basically why my opponent lost the game. And it's of course sad to lose this way, but it's one of those things that you just have to go through and you learn from it. So anyway, that was round 7. Super happy with my win, but I'm looking forward to play someone higher rated. That would be really nice because I'm a little bit scared of underrated 1800s. You never know what to expect. So I feel quite lucky today. But yeah, let's see what happens tomorrow. For now, I'm going to take some rest. I'm also really happy that this game finished early, that this never happens. I'm always super late with my games and then also recording the recap. So anyway, without further ado, guys, thank you so much for watching. Thanks for the support. I'm on, how many points do I have? 5 out of 7. Not bad at all. Let's try to do well in the next 2 rounds. Thank you so much for watching. Thanks for the support, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Bye!